Welcome to number 5 in our series on George Grant, the Owl, and JADIS. In this fifth one, we're going to look at George Grant, Athens and Jerusalem Beyond Dilatantism. Dilettante or voyeur is usually someone who has a very superficial understanding of something rather than a substantive understanding, and then they pass all sorts of judgments about a civilization, a thinker, a perspective, but usually only a very thin understanding. First of all, why should we even be interested in Jerusalem, classical Jewish tradition, the Athenian Greek tradition, the Roman tradition, and the great Christian synthesis of that? Large elements of the modern and postmodern world, they've essentially clear-cut anything to do with the past, and then it leaves people very bereft in terms of when they are obviously on a conscious search for deeper meaning, for purpose, for why am I here, what's the purpose of life. And when all those old markings have been destroyed, people then are very, very, very much naive victims of the newest guru in town or the newest hawker of meaning. And this is why to be grounded in the best of the past is to have the wisdom to move forward wisely and judiciously into the future. Now, Athens and Jerusalem, often, sadly so, and this is where the dilettante side comes in, there's ways of approaching this that distort both the Athenian or the classical Greek tradition as well as the classical Jewish. The one at the most superficial of all levels argues that the Greeks are dualists, elevate spirit, denigrate matter, elevate mind, denigrate the physical world, or they're pure rationalists in a fairly narrow scientific sense, and unless something can be proved logically, inductively, deductively, therefore it's not even worthy of attention. And so you have these two characters, and that's often pitted against a holistic and integrated Hebrew tradition, a form of understanding the faith that honors and respects the poetic, the thoughtful, the revelatory, and these sorts of things in which. And so you get this contrast of a highly idealized Jewish tradition and to some degree a denigrated Greek tradition. Now what I've already mentioned is in fact the Jewish tradition is complex. So the previous thing I looked at is you can't just say the Jewish tradition is this integrated holistic value. In fact there's huge tensions theologically and ethically at work in the Jewish tradition. And so if a person's going to honestly approach other than a dilettantish and a voyeur, where one has to enter the difficult issues presented by biblical Judaism. The other hand, what we get in the Greek tradition is something far more than merely rationalism or antimatter. In fact, some of the most sophisticated, and I think it could be argued, and this is why Grant and many very important Christian thinkers have turned to the classical tradition, and why the early Christian tradition brought together the Greek heritage of Plato and Aristotle. We find not rationalism, we find not dualism. The dualism side is more Gnosticism and an extreme form of Gnosticism. So when people reduce the Greek tradition to spirit versus matter, they're not talking Plato, they're not talking Aristotle, they're talking variations of Gnosticism, and usually the more extreme forms of Gnosticism. So that should be made clear. There's a great difference between Greek thinking, sophisticated Greek thinking, and Gnosticism. The Greek tradition, philosophically and theologically, is rooted in the notion of love and the human longing to be united with the ultimate, with one another. You read the Symposium, you read the Phaedrus in Plato, read Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Friendship and contemplation is the very highest in terms of the human spirit's longings, and when we turn to lesser goods, we begin to lose ourselves. In the Christian theological tradition, our image and likeness becomes muted, we become blind to who we're meant to be, we take paths which do ourselves hurt and harm. So in the Greek tradition there is a profound ethical, theological, philosophical heritage that in some ways can come as a corrective to sometimes a complex and polyphonic Jewish tradition, and it assists people in getting out of the dilemmas that the Jewish theological tradition raises. So when we begin to think Athens and Jerusalem, we need a much more profound understanding of Athens and the classical civilization than a simple reductionism and we need a much more sophisticated understanding of the Jewish tradition other than a pure revelatory tradition in which no questions can be asked. And this is why someone like George Grant and some of the more important thinkers of the Christian world have grappled with these tensions and tried to synthesize the noblest prophetic elements of the Jewish tradition with the noblest prophetic and contemplative elements of the Greek tradition.